At 9:17 on the morning of January 22, 1943, a 27-year-old second lieutenant crouched in the ruins of a destroyed Japanese bunker on Guadalcanal. He was watching a banyan tree 240 yards away through a scope that his fellow officers had laughed at for 6 weeks straight. His name was John George, Illinois state shooting champion. 0 confirmed kills, and in his hands was a rifle that the United States Army had officially declared a toy. Here is a statistic that will make you question everything you know about military snipers. In the Pacific theater of World War II, Japanese snipers were killing American soldiers at a ratio of 14-1. 14 Americans dead for every single Japanese sniper eliminated. The United States Army, the most powerful military force on the planet, was being systematically dismantled by men hiding in trees with bolt-action rifles. But in 4 days, one man with a rifle he bought through a mail-order catalog would flip that ratio completely upside down. 22 Japanese snipers, 24 rounds fired, 22 confirmed kills. And the weapon that did it was not issued by the military. It was not approved by any general. It was purchased with 2 years of National Guard pay from a hunting supply company in Illinois. This is the story of John George and the mail-order rifle that changed how the American military understood precision shooting forever. To understand why John George's story matters, you need to understand what was happening on Guadalcanal in late 1942 and early 1943. The island was hell. 6 months of constant combat. Tropical diseases killing more men than bullets. Temperatures reaching 100 degrees with humidity so thick you could taste the jungle rotting around you. The Marines had landed in August of 1942 and captured Henderson Field, the only operational airstrip in the Solomon Islands. They held it through wave after wave of Japanese counterattacks. Banzai charges at night, naval bombardments that shook the earth. Supply ships sunk before they could unload food and ammunition. By December of 1942, the Marines were exhausted. Some units had been fighting for 5 straight months without rotation. That is when the Army arrived to relieve them. The 132nd Infantry Regiment, fresh from training in the United States, shipped in to take over positions the Marines had bled for. These soldiers had never seen combat. They had trained at Camp Forest in Tennessee, shooting at paper targets and practicing maneuvers in forests that looked nothing like the Pacific jungle. They were about to learn a brutal lesson about the difference between training and war. The Japanese had a problem. They were losing the battle for Henderson Field. Their supply lines were cut. Their reinforcements were being sunk by American submarines and aircraft. But they had one advantage that the Americans could not match: snipers. Japanese military doctrine emphasized individual marksmanship to a degree that Western armies did not understand. Their snipers were trained to climb into trees before dawn, tie themselves to branches so they would not fall if wounded, and wait for hours without moving. They carried the Arisaka Type 99 rifle with a 4-power scope. They knew how to use jungle foliage for concealment, and they were terrifyingly patient. In the first 3 days that the 132nd Infantry operated in the Point Cruz groves west of Henderson Field, Japanese snipers killed 14 American soldiers, 14 men, shot from trees they could not see by enemies they could not locate. The battalion commander sent patrols to find the snipers. The patrols walked within feet of the trees where the Japanese were hiding and saw nothing. One patrol passed the same banyan tree twice in an hour. On the 3rd pass, a sniper shot their sergeant through the neck from 90 feet up. The man was dead before he hit the ground. The American military response was predictable. Call in artillery, blast the trees. The problem was simple. You cannot shell what you cannot see. The Japanese snipers moved positions constantly. They never fired from the same tree twice in a row. Artillery strikes destroyed hundreds of trees and killed exactly 0 snipers. The 132nd Infantry was being bled dry by an enemy they could not find, could not fight, and could not stop. And then a second lieutenant with a hunting rifle asked permission to try something different. John George was not supposed to be a combat officer. He grew up in Illinois during the Great Depression, the son of a machinist who taught him to shoot before he taught him to read. By age 12, George was winning local rifle competitions. By age 16, he was beating grown men at regional championships. In 1939, at the age of 23, he won the Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards. Not 100 yards, not 500 yards, 1,000 yards. That is 10 football fields. At that distance, you cannot see your target with the naked eye. The wind can push your bullet 3 feet off course. The slightest error in breathing the smallest twitch of your finger and you miss by a yard. George did not miss. He joined the Illinois National Guard in 1940, partly out of patriotism, and partly because it paid enough for him to pursue his passion for competitive shooting. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, George was activated for federal service. He was assigned to the 132nd Infantry Regiment as a rifle platoon leader. Standard infantry officer, nothing special on paper. But George had a problem. The standard issue rifle for the United States Army was the M1 Garand. Semi-automatic 8-round clip, effective range of about 500 yards with iron sights. The Garand was a revolutionary weapon. It gave American infantry a rate of fire that no other army could match, but it was not a precision instrument. It was designed for volume of fire, not pinpoint accuracy. George had grown up shooting bolt-action rifles with scopes. He knew what those weapons could do in trained hands, and he believed that the Army was making a critical mistake by ignoring precision marksmanship in favor of firepower. Before shipping out to the Pacific, George spent 2 years of saved National Guard pay on a Winchester Model 70 rifle. The Model 70 was considered the finest bolt-action sporting rifle in the world. It had a smooth action, a crisp trigger, and legendary accuracy. George added a Lyman Alaskan scope with 2.5 power magnification and a Griffin and Howe mount that would hold 0 even after being banged around in combat conditions. The total cost was nearly $300. That was half a year's salary for most Americans in 1942. George considered it money well spent. When he unpacked the rifle at Camp Forest in Tennessee, his fellow officers laughed. Captain Morris, his company commander, asked if George planned to hunt deer or Germans with his toy. The battalion armorer wanted to know why George had brought a mail-order sweetheart to a real war. Every officer in the regiment carried the same weapon, the same equipment, the same uniform. George had just announced that he thought he knew better than the United States Army. That kind of attitude did not make you popular. The regiment shipped out before George's rifle arrived from the manufacturer. For 6 weeks during the voyage to the Pacific, George watched other men clean their Garands, while his Winchester sat in a warehouse in Illinois. He requested that it be forwarded through military mail. The request was approved, but barely. Captain Morris made it clear that when the rifle arrived, George was to leave it in his tent and carry a real weapon into combat. The Winchester was not Army issue. It was not Army approved. As far as the Army was concerned, it did not exist. The wooden crate arrived in late December 1942, just days after the 132nd Infantry reached Guadalcanal. George opened it in his tent that night. The rifle was packed in Cosmoline, a thick petroleum jelly that protected metal from rust during ocean voyages. He spent 4 hours cleaning every component: the barrel, the action, the trigger mechanism, the scope, mounts. When he was finished, the rifle was perfect. 9 pounds of precision engineering designed for one purpose and one purpose only: to put a bullet exactly where the shooter wanted it to go. George carried the Winchester anyway. He ignored Captain Morris's orders. He strapped the rifle to his pack alongside his issued Garand and marched into the jungle with both weapons. For 16 days during the assault on Mount Austin, he never fired the Winchester once. The fighting was too close. Bunker-to-bunker combat at ranges measured in feet, not yards. The Garand was the right tool for that work, but George knew that different terrain would require different solutions. And on January 21, 1943, the battalion commander gave him a chance to prove it. The summons came at night. George was ordered to report to battalion headquarters immediately. When he arrived, he found the commander studying a map of the Point Cruz groves with the expression of absolute frustration. 14 men dead in 3 days. Patrols unable to locate the enemy. Artillery strikes hitting nothing but trees. The commander had run out of conventional options. He had heard about George's shooting trophies and his mail-order rifle. He wanted to know if any of it was real or just barracks talk. George explained his credentials. Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards. Consistent 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights. 5-round groups inside 4 inches at 300 yards with the Lyman Alaskan scope. The commander listened without expression. Then he asked the only question that mattered. Could George kill Japanese snipers with that rifle George said he could try? The commander gave him until morning to prove it. If the mail-order rifle did not produce results, George would leave it behind permanently and carry a standard Garand, like everyone else. That night, George checked his Winchester one more time. He verified the scope mounts were tight. He loaded 5 rounds of .30-06 hunting ammunition that he had packed in Tennessee. Military ball ammunition, the same cartridge the Garand fired. Then he lay down on his cot and tried to sleep. He could not. At 3 in the morning he gave up and sat in the darkness with the rifle across his lap, waiting for dawn, waiting for a chance to prove that everything he believed about precision shooting was true. At first light on January 22nd, George moved into position in the ruins of a Japanese bunker that his battalion had captured 3 days earlier. The bunker overlooked the coconut groves where the Japanese snipers were operating. Banyan trees, some of them 90 feet tall with trunks 8 feet thick. A sniper could climb one of those trees before dawn and sit there all day without being seen from the ground. George had brought no spotter, no radio man, just his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition. He settled into the bunker, pressed his eye to the scope, and began to scan the trees. The Lyman Alaskan had only 2.5 power magnification. Not much compared to modern scopes, but it was enough to see movement in the branches that the naked eye would miss. At 9:17 in the morning, George saw it. A branch moved. No wind. Just a small shift, 87 feet up in a banyan tree 240 yards away. George watched. The branch moved again. Then he saw the shape. A man in dark clothing positioned in a fork where 3 branches met. The Japanese sniper was facing east, watching the trail where American supply parties had been moving. George adjusted his scope. 2 clicks right for wind. He controlled his breathing. The Winchester's trigger broke like glass at 3.5 pounds. He had spent hours adjusting it at Camp Perry before the war. Now he would find out if a civilian target rifle could kill a man trained to kill him first. George exhaled slowly, let half the breath out, held it. He squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked into his shoulder. The sound cracked through the jungle. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked and fell. His body tumbled 90 feet through the branches and hit the ground near the base of the banyan tree. 1 shot. 1 kill. The mail-order rifle had just proven itself in combat. But George was not finished. Japanese snipers worked in pairs. 1 shooter, 1 spotter. If George had just killed the shooter, the spotter was somewhere nearby, watching, waiting, preparing to avenge his partner. George worked the bolt, chambered another round, and began scanning the surrounding trees. The hunt had only just begun. And in the next 3 days, John George would kill 21 more Japanese snipers, survive mortar strikes, machine gun fire, and a close-range firefight that should have ended his life. The officers who had laughed at his mail-order rifle were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. In Part 1, you met John George, a 27-year-old second lieutenant from Illinois, state shooting champion, 0 combat experience, and a Winchester Model 70 rifle that the United States Army officially declared a toy. In 4 days on Guadalcanal, George killed 22 Japanese snipers with 24 rounds. He proved that a civilian rifle purchased through a mail-order catalog could outperform every military solution the Army had tried. But killing snipers was one thing. Convincing the United States military to change its entire approach to precision shooting was something else entirely. Here is a statistic that explains why George's success almost died in a tent on Guadalcanal. In 1943, the United States Army had 0 official sniper training programs. None. The Marines had disbanded their sniper units after World War I. The Army considered long-range precision shooting a waste of resources. Every general, every colonel, every training manual in the American military said the same thing. Modern warfare was about firepower, not marksmanship. Volume of fire wins battles. Individual shooters are irrelevant. John George had just proven them all wrong. And that made him very dangerous to the men who had built their careers on being right. The morning after George killed his first Japanese sniper, Captain Morris summoned him to the command tent. George expected congratulations. He had eliminated a threat that killed 14 Americans in 3 days. Instead, he found Morris standing behind a folding table with 2 other officers. Their expressions were not friendly. Morris spoke first. He wanted to know why George had disobeyed a direct order. The order to leave the Winchester in his tent. The order to carry only Army-issued weapons. George explained that the situation required a specialized tool. The Japanese snipers were operating at ranges beyond what the Garand could reliably engage. The Winchester with its scope gave him the precision needed to identify and eliminate targets that regular infantry could not even see. Morris cut him off. The captain did not care about precision. He cared about discipline. He cared about maintaining unit cohesion. Every man in the battalion carried the same weapon. Every man followed the same tactics. George had decided unilaterally that he knew better than the entire United States Army. That kind of arrogance got men killed. George asked a simple question. How many men had the Japanese snipers killed in the past 3 days? Morris did not answer. George answered for him. 14. 14 Americans dead. 0 Japanese snipers eliminated. The standard tactics were not working. The standard weapons were not working. Something had to change, or the battalion would continue bleeding men every single day. The second officer spoke. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the battalion executive officer. He wanted George to understand the bigger picture. The Army was fighting a global war. They could not customize equipment for every soldier who thought he had a better idea. If George used his civilian rifle, and it malfunctioned, if he missed a shot and got someone killed, if word spread that officers were ignoring regulations, the entire command structure would break down. Rules existed for reasons. George had one response. He had not missed. 1 shot, 1 kill. The Winchester had performed exactly as designed. The only breakdown he could see was the Army's refusal to adapt to battlefield reality. Harrison's face turned red. He informed George that the discussion was over. George would surrender the Winchester immediately. He would face disciplinary review for insubordination. His combat record would reflect that he had engaged the enemy with unauthorized equipment. This was not a negotiation. George stood at attention and said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had killed a Japanese sniper who had killed Americans. And now he was being punished for it. The military bureaucracy had decided that following procedure mattered more than saving lives. But George had underestimated something. He had underestimated how fast word travels in a combat zone. By noon on January 22nd, every man in the 132nd Infantry knew what George had done. The lieutenant with the mail-order rifle had killed a Japanese sniper at 240 yards. Then he killed another, then another. While Harrison and Morris debated regulations in a tent, George was back in his bunker position, putting rounds into targets that no one else could see. By the end of the first day, he had eliminated 5 Japanese snipers. 5 men who would have killed more Americans. 5 threats, neutralized with 5 bullets. The enlisted men started calling him Deadeye George. The sergeants started asking how they could get rifles like his, and one officer started paying very close attention. Colonel Alexander Ferry, the regimental commander, had been watching the casualty reports with growing frustration. He had inherited an impossible situation. Japanese snipers controlled the Point Cruz groves. His men were dying, and his subordinate officers were more concerned about procedure than results. That night, Ferry summoned George to regimental headquarters. Not to discipline him, to ask questions. Ferry wanted to understand how George had achieved in one day what the entire battalion could not achieve in a week. George explained his approach. The Lyman Alaskan scope allowed him to identify targets that were invisible to the naked eye. The Winchester's accuracy let him engage at ranges where the Japanese could not effectively return fire. And his years of competitive shooting had taught him patience, the ability to wait for the right shot instead of wasting ammunition on uncertain targets. Ferry listened without interruption. When George finished, the colonel asked what he needed to continue operations. George gave him a list: more ammunition, a better position, and protection from officers who wanted to confiscate his rifle. Ferry agreed to all three conditions. Then he added one of his own. George had 48 hours to prove that his methods could be replicated. If he could train other men to shoot like him, Ferry would create an official sniper section for the regiment. If he could not, George would surrender the Winchester and never speak of it again. George had his chance. But 48 hours was not much time, and the Japanese were about to make everything much harder. The morning of January 23rd began with rain. Heavy tropical rain that turned visibility into a solid wall of gray. George sat in his new position, a cluster of rocks 70 yards south of his original bunker, and waited for the weather to clear. He used the time to prepare. He checked his rifle. He calculated ranges to likely target areas. He studied the terrain through his scope during brief breaks in the downpour. At 8:15, the rain slowed. By 8:45, enough visibility had returned for work. George began scanning the banyan trees. The Japanese snipers had learned from yesterday. They were staying higher in the canopy. They were moving less. They were adapting to the presence of an American who could actually shoot back. George found his first target of the day at 9:12, a Japanese soldier positioned 290 yards out. Longer range than anything he had attempted before. The man had chosen his tree well. Dense foliage around him. No clear silhouette against the sky. But George could see the faint outline of shoulders through a gap in the branches. He adjusted for distance and wind. He controlled his breathing. He squeezed the trigger. The sniper fell. 6 confirmed kills. What happened next changed everything. At 9:57, Japanese mortars began hitting the area around George's position. The first salvo landed 40 yards short. The second landed 20 yards short. They were triangulating based on his muzzle flash or the sound of his rifle. The third salvo would be on target. George grabbed his Winchester and ran. He sprinted north along the tree line and dove into a shell crater as explosions tore apart the rocks behind him. Debris rained down around him. His ears rang from the concussions. The Japanese had just demonstrated that they understood his threat. They were willing to expend mortar ammunition to eliminate a single shooter. That meant George was working. He relocated to a fallen tree 120 yards north of his destroyed position. He settled in and resumed scanning. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon. They knew George was hunting them. They were now hunting him back. This was no longer target shooting. This was a duel between professionals. At 2:23 p.m., George killed his 7th sniper. At 3:41 p.m., he killed his 8th. This one had climbed 94 feet up a banyan tree. Excellent concealment. But the afternoon sun created a silhouette against the sky when the light angle changed. George saw it. The Japanese sniper did not see him. 1 shot. 1 kill. By the end of January 23rd, George had eliminated 8 Japanese snipers over 2 days. 12 rounds fired. 8 confirmed kills, 4 misses due to wind or target movement. A hit rate of 67% at ranges up to 290 yards against trained military snipers who were actively hunting him. Colonel Ferry reviewed the numbers that night. 8 snipers eliminated. 0 American casualties during George's operations. The ratio had completely reversed. Before George, the Japanese were killing 14 Americans for every sniper lost. Now George was killing 8 Japanese without losing a single man. Ferry made his decision. George would continue operations, and Ferry would find more rifles. The next morning, January 24th, brought the most dangerous engagement yet. George had relocated to a water-filled shell crater, positioning himself where the Japanese would not expect. He was chest-deep in muddy water with his Winchester resting on the crater rim when he spotted movement. A Japanese sniper in a palm tree. Low position. Only 40 feet up. Too easy. Too obvious. George did not fire. Something was wrong. 10 surviving Japanese snipers would not make elementary mistakes. If the palm tree sniper was bait, the real shooter was positioned elsewhere, watching for anyone who took the shot. George scanned for 11 minutes before he found the threat. A banyan tree, 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up. The Japanese sniper was concealed in a perfect hide, watching the wrong location, waiting for George to appear where he expected him. George had to make a choice: kill the bait and reveal his position, or wait and lose both targets. He chose aggression. He shot the decoy sniper first. Then he immediately swung his rifle toward the real threat. The hidden sniper turned toward the sound of the shot. That movement created exposure. George fired before the man could complete his turn. 2 shots, 2 kills, 10 Japanese snipers down. But George had revealed his position. Machine gun fire raked his previous location 6 seconds after he evacuated. He pressed himself into the mud at the bottom of the crater and waited. The Japanese were coordinating now, snipers working with infantry support. The difficulty level had just increased dramatically. George found the 11th sniper at 10:03 a.m. The man was moving on the ground, not in the trees. Crawling through vegetation toward where George should have been hiding. He had brought support. A second Japanese soldier positioned behind a fallen tree covering the approach. George remained submerged in his water-filled crater, only his eyes above the surface. The Winchester pointed at the sky to keep the barrel clear. He watched the 2 Japanese soldiers execute a sweep pattern. They moved past his position without seeing him. Their backs were exposed. George rose from the water, slowly, silently. He brought the rifle to his shoulder. Water dripped from every surface. He aimed at the closer soldier. 42 yards. He fired. The man dropped. George worked the bolt, chambered another round, swung toward the second target. The soldier was turning, raising his weapon. George fired first. Both men fell. 11 and 12 confirmed kills. But Japanese voices erupted from the tree line. Multiple soldiers. A patrol or recovery team. George had stumbled into a larger operation. He dropped back into the crater as 6 or more Japanese infantry approached the bodies of the men he had just killed. They found his boot prints in the mud. They followed the tracks toward his crater. At 10:31 a.m. a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim and looked directly at George. Their eyes met across 3 feet of distance. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt, while still submerged, rose up and engaged 2 more soldiers at the crater rim. 3 rounds. 3 kills. He climbed out the north side and ran. Japanese rifle fire followed him. Bullets cracked past his head. He dove behind a fallen tree and returned fire twice more. Then he broke contact and sprinted toward American lines. He reached the perimeter at 11:13 a.m. Winchester in hand. 2 rounds remaining. Covered in mud. Alive. Final count for 4 days of operations. 22 Japanese snipers eliminated. 24 rounds fired against confirmed sniper targets. 22 kills. Plus 3 infantry in the close-range firefight. Colonel Ferry got his numbers. John George had proven that precision shooting could change the equation of jungle warfare. But proving a concept and changing an institution are two very different things. The Army still had no sniper program, no training doctrine, no standardized equipment. George had shown what one man could do with the right rifle and the right skills. Now someone had to convince the military bureaucracy to create thousands of such men. And somewhere in the Pacific, Japanese commanders were analyzing reports of a new American threat, a shooter who had eliminated an entire sniper network in 4 days. They did not know his name yet. They did not know his methods, but they knew they had a problem, and they were already developing countermeasures. The hunt for John George was about to begin, and the stakes were about to get much higher. In Part 1, John George arrived on Guadalcanal with a rifle the Army called a toy. In Part 2, he killed 22 Japanese snipers in 4 days and convinced Colonel Ferry to create the first regimental sniper section in the Pacific Theater. The mail-order rifle had proven itself. The military bureaucracy had finally listened. But success on one island meant nothing to the Japanese high command. When intelligence reports reached Tokyo describing an American shooter who had eliminated an entire sniper network single-handedly, the reaction was immediate and terrifying. Here is a statistic that changed everything. In February 1943, Japanese Imperial Army Headquarters issued Directive 2847. The directive ordered all Pacific Theater commanders to identify, locate, and eliminate American precision shooters by any means necessary. Artillery, mortars, infantry assault, coordinated counter-sniper operations. The Japanese had decided that John George and men like him represented a strategic threat worth significant resources to destroy. The hunter had become the hunted, and the real war was about to begin. The Japanese response to George's success was faster and more sophisticated than anyone expected. Within 2 weeks of the Point Cruz operations, Japanese snipers in the Guadalcanal region changed their entire tactical approach. They stopped operating alone. They started working in teams of 4. 2 shooters, 2 spotters, each team positioned to cover the others. If an American sniper engaged one position, the other team would triangulate and return fire before the American could relocate. The casualty reports told the story. In the first week of February 1943, George's sniper section killed 11 Japanese soldiers. They also lost 2 of their own. Sergeant Williams, Corporal Hayes. Both shot by Japanese counter-snipers who had learned to watch for muzzle flash and wait for the American shooter to chamber a second round. The bolt-action rifles that gave American snipers their accuracy also gave Japanese counter-snipers a window of vulnerability. Chamber. Aim. Fire. Work the bolt. In that 2-second gap, a trained marksman could put a bullet through your skull. George analyzed the losses and recognized the pattern. The Japanese were adapting faster than his men could learn. He needed better tactics. He needed more training time. He needed rifles that could fire faster without sacrificing accuracy. He had none of these things. What he had was 16 men with Springfield rifles and a war that would not wait for perfect solutions. The situation deteriorated through February. Japanese mortar teams began targeting any position where sniper activity was reported. They would saturate an area with explosive rounds, forcing American shooters to relocate constantly. Movement meant exposure. Exposure meant death. George's section went from 11 kills in the first week to 6 kills in the second week to 3 kills in the third week. The Japanese were winning the adaptation race. Colonel Ferry summoned George to regimental headquarters on February 5th. The meeting was not friendly. Ferry had staked his reputation on the sniper program. Division command was asking questions. Why were American snipers dying? Why had kill rates dropped? Was this experiment worth the resources being invested? Ferry needed answers. George had only one. The enemy was learning. The Americans needed to learn faster. But learning takes time. And on February 7th, time ran out for John George. The morning started like every other. George moved into position at dawn, a shell crater 200 yards from the tree line where Japanese activity had been reported. He settled in with his Winchester and began scanning through the Lyman Alaskan scope. At 8:47 a.m., he spotted movement. A Japanese soldier climbing into a banyan tree 400 yards out. Long range, difficult shot. George adjusted for distance and wind. He controlled his breathing. He squeezed the trigger. The shot missed. Wind gust. The bullet passed 6 inches left of the target. George worked the bolt to chamber another round. That was when the Japanese counter-sniper fired. The bullet struck George in the left shoulder. The impact spun him sideways and knocked him flat against the crater wall. Pain exploded through his upper body. He could not feel his left arm. Blood soaked through his uniform in seconds. Somewhere in the tree line, a Japanese marksman was working his own bolt, preparing to fire again. George did not think. He rolled. He pushed himself over the crater rim and tumbled down the reverse slope. A second bullet cracked through the air where his head had been. He kept rolling until he reached a drainage ditch 20 yards away. Then he lay still, pressing his right hand against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, while the world went gray around the edges. Corporal Martinez found him 40 minutes later. George was conscious, but pale. He had lost significant blood. Martinez dragged him back to American lines and called for a corpsman. The medics worked on George for 2 hours before evacuating him to the field hospital near Henderson Field. The doctors said he was lucky. The bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. He would recover. But he needed 3 weeks minimum before returning to combat operations. George spent those 3 weeks in a hospital tent listening to reports from the front. The sniper section continued operations without him. They killed 19 more Japanese soldiers. They lost 4 more Americans. The kill ratio was improving, but the cost was high. Too high. Something fundamental needed to change. The change came from an unexpected direction. On February 9th, the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. The campaign was over. American forces controlled the island. But the war was far from finished. And somewhere in the military bureaucracy, people were finally paying attention to what John George had accomplished. The orders arrived on February 28th. George was being transferred. Not to another infantry unit, not to a training facility in the United States. He was being assigned to a new organization, something classified, something that would take him deeper into the Pacific than any American soldier had gone before. The orders mentioned jungle warfare, long-range patrols, operations behind enemy lines, the kind of mission where a man with George's skills might prove invaluable. The organization had no official name yet. The men who were gathering for it called themselves something else. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. George arrived in India in April 1943. The heat was brutal. The humidity was worse than Guadalcanal. 3,000 men were assembling at a training camp in central India, preparing for a mission that most military analysts considered impossible. They would march over 700 miles through the Burmese jungle. No roads, no supply lines, no artillery support. Just rifles and determination, and the ability to move fast through terrain the Japanese believed impassable. The target was Myetkina Airfield, the only operational airstrip in northern Burma. Japanese forces controlled the region with 4,000 troops. Capture the airfield and Allied supply routes into China would open. Fail, and 3,000 Americans would die in a jungle that would swallow their bodies without a trace. George modified his equipment for the Burma campaign. Every ounce mattered when you were carrying 60 pounds of gear through mountains and swamps for months at a time. He replaced the Lyman Alaskan scope with a lighter Weaver 330. Same magnification, 8 ounces less weight. He replaced the wooden stock with a synthetic version. The modifications reduced his Winchester from 9 pounds 12 ounces to 8 pounds 14 ounces. Not much, but over 700 miles, every ounce became a pound. The Marauders entered Burma on February 24, 1944. The march that followed was hell. 83 miles in the first week. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria cases multiplied daily. Pack mules broke legs on steep descents and had to be shot. The Japanese harassed them constantly. Ambushes, snipers, probing attacks that forced the Americans to deploy and fight before melting back into the jungle. George used his Winchester 3 times during the march, once at 412 yards against a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing, once at 380 yards against a machine gun position that had pinned down an American patrol, once at 290 yards against a sniper who was picking off Marauder scouts. 3 shots, 3 kills. But the Burma campaign was different from Guadalcanal. Most combat was close range, 50 yards or less, ambushes in dense vegetation where you could not see 30 feet ahead. The precision rifle that had dominated on Guadalcanal spent most of Burma strapped to George's pack, while he fought with a standard Garand. The Marauders reached Myitkyina on May 17, 1944. They had covered over 700 miles. They had lost more men to disease than combat: malaria, dysentery, typhus. The unit that entered Burma with 3,000 men was down to fewer than 1,300 effective fighters. But they had done the impossible. They had crossed terrain the Japanese thought impassable. They had captured the airfield that would open supply routes to China. George survived Burma. His Winchester survived. But the campaign had taught him something important. Modern warfare was changing. The bolt-action rifle that had made him legendary on Guadalcanal was becoming obsolete. Semi-automatic weapons were the future. Volume of fire combined with accuracy. The next generation of military rifles would need both. George was evacuated from Burma with the rest of the Marauders in June 1944. The unit was disbanded. Too many casualties. Too much time in the jungle without proper support. George was promoted to captain and reassigned to Fort Benning, Georgia. Training duties. Teaching the next generation of infantry officers what he had learned in the Pacific. He never fired his Winchester in combat again. But the legacy of what George accomplished on Guadalcanal and in Burma spread through the military like fire through dry grass. His after-action reports were studied at the infantry school. His tactics were incorporated into training manuals. The sniper section he created on Guadalcanal became the model for similar units across the Pacific theater. By the end of 1944, every Army division in the Pacific had some form of precision shooting capability. Not formalized, not standardized, but present. Men with scoped rifles. Men trained to engage targets at ranges that regular infantry could not reach. Men who understood that one well-aimed shot could accomplish what 100 poorly aimed shots could not. The numbers told the story. In 1943, American forces in the Pacific killed an estimated 2,300 Japanese soldiers through precision rifle fire. In 1944, that number increased to over 8,000. In 1945, it exceeded 14,000. The doctrine that George had proven on Guadalcanal was saving American lives across the entire theater of war. Colonel Ferry received a commendation for establishing the first regimental sniper program. George received 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. The Winchester Model 70 that had killed 22 Japanese snipers sat in a footlocker at Fort Benning cleaned and oiled, but never fired. The war ended in August 1945. George was discharged in January 1947 with the rank of lieutenant colonel. He enrolled at Princeton University on the GI Bill. He studied politics. He earned highest honors. He spent 4 years at Oxford. He worked in British East Africa, studying regional institutions. He eventually settled in Washington, D.C. as an expert on African affairs. He never spoke publicly about Guadalcanal. He never gave interviews about the mail-order rifle. His colleagues knew he had served in the Pacific, but they did not know the details. They did not know about the 22 Japanese snipers. They did not know about the mortar strikes and the machine gun fire and the bullet through the shoulder. They did not know that the quiet academic who studied African politics had once been the deadliest shooter in the South Pacific. But the story did not end there. In 1981, George decided to write down what had happened. Not for fame, not for recognition, just to document the weapons and tactics of jungle warfare before the details faded from memory. The manuscript became a book. The book became a classic, and John George became a legend among people who understood what precision shooting really meant. The final chapter of his story is one that few people know. A chapter about legacy, about how one man's defiance of military bureaucracy changed how armies think about individual skill, about what happened to the Winchester Model 70 after George died, and about a museum in Virginia where the mail-order rifle sits today, waiting for someone to understand what it represents. That chapter comes next, and it might be the most important part of the entire story. In Part 1, a 27-year-old second lieutenant from Illinois arrived on Guadalcanal with a rifle the United States Army called a toy. In Part 2, he killed 22 Japanese snipers in 4 days and convinced his commanders to create the first regimental sniper section in the Pacific Theater. In Part 3, that success spread across the military, survived a bullet through the shoulder, and helped shape how American forces would fight for the rest of the war. John George proved that one man with the right skills and the right weapon could change the mathematics of combat entirely. But what happened to the man behind the mail-order rifle? What happened when the shooting stopped, and the medals were handed out, and the world moved on to other wars? This story has one final chapter, a chapter about legacy, about recognition, about a rifle that sits in a museum today waiting for someone to understand what it represents. And there is a twist at the end that almost nobody knows. Because sometimes the men who change history are the same men that history forgets. John George was discharged from the United States Army in January 1947 with the rank of lieutenant colonel. He had served 6 years. He had fought on 2 islands and marched 700 miles through the Burmese jungle. He had killed more enemy soldiers with a rifle than most infantry platoons killed in their entire deployment. He had 2 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart, a combat infantry badge, and absolutely no idea what to do with the rest of his life. The transition to civilian life was harder than George expected. The skills that made him valuable in combat had no obvious application in peacetime America. He could shoot a man at 400 yards. He could identify enemy positions through jungle foliage. He could survive on minimal supplies in hostile terrain for weeks at a time. None of these abilities helped him find a job in 1947. George enrolled at Princeton University on the GI Bill. He was 31 years old, surrounded by students a decade younger who had spent the war in classrooms instead of bunkers. He studied politics and international relations. He discovered that he had a talent for academic work that he had never suspected. He graduated with highest honors in 1950. Then he went to Oxford for 4 more years. Then to British East Africa to study regional politics and institutions. The transformation was remarkable. The man who had crouched in water-filled craters shooting Japanese snipers became a respected scholar of African affairs. He joined the Institute of African American Relations in Washington, D.C. Later, he worked as a consultant for the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute. He gave lectures. He wrote academic papers. He built a career that had nothing to do with rifles or scopes or the art of killing men at distance. His colleagues knew he had served in the Pacific. They did not know the details. George never talked about Guadalcanal. He never mentioned the 22 Japanese snipers. He never displayed his medals or showed anyone the Winchester Model 70 that sat in a footlocker in his closet. The war was a closed chapter, a part of his life that belonged to a different person. The men who had mocked his mail-order rifle followed different paths. Captain Morris, who had ordered George to leave the Winchester in his tent, was killed on Bougainville in 1944. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had threatened George with disciplinary action, retired as a full colonel in 1958 and never spoke publicly about the sniper program he had tried to shut down. Colonel Ferry, who had given George the chance to prove himself, rose to brigadier general and spent the rest of his career advocating for specialized training programs that the Army bureaucracy consistently rejected. George outlived them all. He watched the Korean War from Washington. He watched Vietnam from academic conferences. He watched the evolution of military rifles from the Garand to the M14 to the M16. He watched sniping become a formal military specialty with dedicated schools and standardized equipment. Everything he had proven on Guadalcanal was eventually accepted as doctrine. It just took 30 years. But the real legacy of John George was not measured in medals or military doctrine. It was measured in the lives that his method saved across 3 generations of American warfare. The sniper program that George pioneered on Guadalcanal became the template for precision shooting doctrine throughout the Pacific Theater. By 1944, every Army division had some form of designated marksman capability. The numbers were not large. Perhaps 2 or 3 men per battalion with scoped rifles and specialized training. But those men had an impact far beyond their numbers. Military historians estimate that American snipers in World War II killed approximately 38,000 enemy soldiers across all theaters. That number increased dramatically in Korea, where terrain and defensive warfare made precision shooting even more valuable. In Vietnam, American snipers achieved kill ratios that would have seemed impossible in 1943. 1 confirmed kill for every 1.3 rounds fired. Compare that to the infantry average of 50,000 rounds per confirmed kill during the same conflict. The doctrine evolved. The equipment improved. But the core principle remained exactly what George had demonstrated on Guadalcanal. A trained marksman with a precision rifle could accomplish what massed infantry fire could not. 1 well-aimed shot was worth more than 1,000 poorly aimed shots. Individual skill mattered. Patience mattered. The ability to wait for the right moment instead of blazing away at uncertain targets mattered. The Winchester Model 70 that George carried became legendary in its own right. The rifle was designated by the United States Marine Corps as its primary sniper platform from 1966 to 1970. Marines in Vietnam carried the same basic design that George had purchased through a mail-order catalog in 1942. The action was the same. The accuracy was the same. Only the scope had changed. Modern military sniping owes a direct debt to John George and men like him. The M24 sniper weapon system adopted by the Army in 1988 was based on the Remington 700 itself, a direct descendant of the bolt-action hunting rifles that George had championed. The philosophy of precision over volume that George proved in combat remains the foundation of sniper doctrine in every major military force on Earth. 70 nations today maintain formal sniper training programs. Thousands of military personnel graduate from these programs every year. The techniques they learn can be traced in an unbroken line back to the jungle fighting of World War II. Back to a handful of men who figured out how to use hunting rifles against trained military adversaries. Back to a second lieutenant from Illinois who refused to accept that the Army knew better than he did. But the lesson of John George's story goes beyond military doctrine. It goes beyond rifles and scopes and the mathematics of long-range shooting. The real lesson is about institutions and innovation and why organizations so often reject the ideas that could save them. Consider what George faced in January 1943. He had a solution to a problem that was killing American soldiers. The solution was proven. The results were documented. And the Army's response was to threaten him with disciplinary action for using unauthorized equipment. The institution valued conformity over effectiveness, following procedures over saving lives. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Billy Mitchell was court-martialed in 1925 for advocating air power against naval vessels. The Army rejected his ideas. 20 years later, Japanese aircraft sank the battleship fleet at Pearl Harbor. The generals who had mocked Mitchell spent the rest of the war building the air force he had envisioned. Heinz Guderian developed armored warfare doctrine in the 1930s. The German army establishment considered his ideas impractical and dangerous. In 1940, his panzer divisions conquered France in 6 weeks, using exactly the tactics his superiors had dismissed. The pattern is always the same. An outsider sees something the institution cannot see. The institution rejects the idea because it threatens existing power structures and contradicts established doctrine. The outsider is proven right, usually at tremendous cost in lives and resources. The institution eventually adopts the innovation and pretends it was their idea all along. John George was never court-martialed. He was never officially punished for carrying his Winchester into combat. But he was also never officially recognized as the pioneer of American sniper doctrine. The Army did not want to admit that a second lieutenant with a hunting rifle had solved a problem that generals with entire battalions could not solve. That admission would have raised uncomfortable questions about what else the Army was getting wrong. This brings us to a detail that almost nobody knows. A piece of the story that was hidden for decades and only came to light when researchers began digging through declassified documents in the 1990s. In 1981, John George decided to write a book about his experiences in World War II. The book was called Shots Fired in Anger. It documented the weapons and tactics of jungle warfare with clinical precision. George described Japanese rifles and American rifles. He explained ballistics and trajectory. He detailed the techniques he had developed for identifying and engaging targets in dense vegetation. The book became a classic among firearms enthusiasts and military historians. But George left something out, something he never told anyone during his lifetime. In 1946, 1 year after the war ended, the United States Army conducted a classified study of sniper operations in the Pacific Theater. The study examined kill rates, equipment effectiveness, and tactical doctrine. The study concluded that precision rifle programs had saved an estimated 4,200 American lives during the Pacific Campaign. 4,200 men who would have died if the Army had continued relying exclusively on volume fire and standard infantry tactics. The study also named the single most effective sniper in the Pacific Theater, the man with the highest confirmed kill count, the man whose methods had been adopted by more units than any other individual shooter. That man was John George. The Army knew. They had always known. They had documented his achievement in classified reports that George himself never saw. They had studied his tactics and incorporated them into training programs. They had used his success to justify budget requests and organizational changes. And they had never told him. George died on January 3, 2009, at the age of 90. He never learned about the classified study. He never knew that the Army had acknowledged him as the most effective sniper of the Pacific War. He spent the last decades of his life believing that his contribution had been forgotten, absorbed into the anonymous mass of military history. The Winchester Model 70 that George carried on Guadalcanal and through Burma was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia, after his death. It sits in a glass case with a small placard describing its history. Most visitors walk past without stopping. It looks like any other vintage hunting rifle. Woodstock, bolt action, a scope that seems primitive by modern standards. But it is not just any rifle. It is the weapon that proved the United States military was wrong about precision shooting. The weapon that cleared the Point Cruz groves when an entire battalion could not. The weapon that changed how armies think about individual marksmanship in modern warfare. From a National Guard weekend warrior with a mail-order rifle to the most effective sniper in the Pacific Theater, John George proved that expertise can come from anywhere, that institutions do not always know best, that sometimes the people closest to a problem can see solutions that the experts miss entirely. His 22 confirmed kills in 4 days remain one of the highest single engagement totals in American military history. The doctrine he pioneered has saved tens of thousands of lives across 8 decades of warfare, and the rifle that made it possible sits in a museum in Virginia, waiting for someone to understand what it represents. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. If you know other stories of forgotten innovators who changed military history, drop them in the comments. This is just one of hundreds of tales from World War II, where ordinary people did extraordinary things because they refused to accept that the experts were right. Subscribe to discover more stories that history almost forgot. Because every weapon, every tactic, every innovation that we take for granted today was once called impossible by someone who should have known better. John George knew better. And 22 Japanese snipers learned the price of underestimating a man with a mail-order rifle.